new page of notes, and this is titled Civil Rights Crisis. This is the last and final page of notes going over civil rights, because after we finish everything tomorrow and Friday, then we're going to dive into Vietnam next week. So Vietnam will actually probably only take Monday, Tuesday, maybe wrap up on Wednesday, and then we'll use the rest of the week, the rest of Wednesday through Friday, to get into 60s culture, 70s culture, and then start getting into the Nixon administration. So that's what's coming. And then our last week together, we probably will be focusing on mostly the 80s, 90s, and then that's probably going to be as far as we'll go. So talking about the civil rights crisis, I'm going to introduce to you a couple more people. We've already talked about Rosa Parks. We've talked about Martin Luther King Jr. Now we need to talk about a few other people, plus other groups, organizations, and individuals. So the process of integrating has been a painfully slow situation. Unfortunately, there's a lot of hesitation and violence that's breaking out because of it. It's something that we've had. I mean, the idea of separating the races has been around ever since slavery began. So this concept is almost as old as the United States is. So obviously that's not something that's just going to change in the blink of an eye. So by the mid-60s, segregation is still holding firm. We have what we call de facto segregation, which just means that it's a tradition. It's something that people are used to. It's not something that you even think twice about. You're just used to the idea that there is a separation in colored individuals and white. So we also have in your notes where it talks about de jure segregation, which is pretty much referencing Plessy versus Ferguson and Jim Crow laws, and saying that those things are legal, that it is legal for the races to be separate. And this is where we start to get into the concept and idea of people claiming that there are scientific reasoning and studies done into the idea that there is a such thing as an inferior and superior race. Unfortunately, there's a lot of violence that's going to break out because of this issue. We see that nonviolent protesters, we've already said this a lot yesterday, nonviolent protesters are going to be met with police dog violence, water hoses. They're going to be arrested just for participating in demonstrations, and a lot of people are getting frustrated. So the problem is that a lot of Martin Luther King Jr.'s followers who have been practicing his nonviolent protesting teachings are going to get frustrated because change it doesn't look like it's happening. It definitely is not happening fast. And people are getting really tired of the idea of turning the other cheek. You know, you can only slap somebody in the face so many times before they're just going to snap and they can't take it anymore. So you're going to see people start abandoning and leaving Dr. King's philosophy and looking for either something else or maybe somebody else to lead them. There are a lot of deaths that happen. Medgar Evers, not a well-known name, but he is a civil rights activist and spokesman. He ends up being assassinated. We know Dr. King is assassinated, and several others will be as well. And so the question of should we be using self-defense comes into play. Not so much the idea of using violence, but the idea of defending yourself if someone else tries to get in your face or mess with you or obviously come against your family. And another question is, should we start just trying to completely separate ourselves. And what I mean by that is the idea that the African American community would completely separate and form their own, almost like a second society. And there were a lot of people that are frustrated, thinking, we're never going to fit into white culture, we're never going to be accepted. Why should we keep trying to look and dress and act like what white culture says that we should? And keep that in mind, because when we start talking about the change in fashion, dress, appearance, hair, things like that, you will notice as we go from the 60s to the 70s, especially for the black community, that they start to embrace their look and get away from what white society has said is considered beautiful. So that's why as we get into the 60s and 70s, especially the 70s, we start to see more of the afros and the different styling of clothing, to where it becomes very popular that it's not just an African American community thing, even though their certain ethnic cultures' hair obviously would do better with that look of doing the afro. But we do see that changes happen with clothing and hairstyles from 60s to 70s, because they are completely abandoning the idea that they have to look at what white culture says is beautiful and do their own look and fashion. And it really catches on. It becomes very popular, even in the white community. So that's for later on. Okay, so let's talk about, we haven't really, I think I've mentioned Malcolm X, but we haven't really talked a whole lot about him yet. Malcolm X comes on the scene, and his legal name is Malcolm Little. And we'll talk about why he changes that here in just a second. But Elijah Muhammad is the leader of the Black Nation of Islam. And he is really looking for a spokesman to speak out for the group. And that's what Malcolm Little, or Malcolm X, ends up becoming. He becomes the name and the face of the Black Nation of Islam. But Elijah Muhammad is encouraging the African American community to, again, separate themselves, to practice using self-defense when and if needed. And that's how these new ideas start to get going, that no longer should we turn the other cheek. The fact that it's an eye for an eye. But the problem is as people start to fight back, in some people's mind, this is justification. Well, look, they're no better than so-and-so. They can't restrain themselves. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't help their cause by any means. Malcolm X comes on the scene. He is the spokesperson, and he talks about why he changes his last name to X. And he said, my ancestors, my grandparents, great-grandparents were slaves, and you should have learned this in American 1, slaves are not allowed to learn how to read and write. And so whenever a slave was told to make their mark, to sign a paper, 9 times out of 10, they would draw an X to make their mark. And so he said, my ancestors' last name has been lost, because the last name they were given, 9 times out of 10, it was the last name of the slave owner, became their last name. It was not their actual family last name. So he said he was adopting the last name X in memory of what had been done to African Americans in the past. Now, there's other groups and other movements that start up. Another movement is the Black Power movement, started up by Stokely Carmichael. Now, Stokely Carmichael was originally a member of the SNCC, the Students for a Nonviolent Coalition Committee, that were practicing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s idea of nonviolence. However, he, again, like several others, was frustrated change wasn't happening. It wasn't happening fast enough, so he abandoned that. He created this concept of the Black Power movement to encourage African Americans to use their power, support one another, to push for social, economic, and political equality, advocate, speak out for themselves. And they are diverging and moving away from Dr. King's followers. And you will notice there's a picture of both people as well as the symbol, that it's the raised closed fist. Yeah, raised closed fist is the sign of the Black Power movement. Interestingly enough, the sign and symbol, the Black Power movement, actually has come back in the last couple of years. There were a lot of major league sports figures that were showing the raised closed fist. So just throwing that out there. Unfortunately, like I said, in the 1960s, see a lot of death. 1964, Malcolm X had made a pilgrimage to Mecca, the holy city for Muslims, and had started to kind of waver his thinking and not really agreeing so much with the idea of self-defense. He comes back, he expresses his idea that he doesn't support that belief anymore, that he does believe that Dr. King is right on his push for nonviolent protesting, and ends up being, unfortunately, a year later, 1965, is assassinated by a member of his own group, the Black Nation of Islam. All right, now let's move on. It goes in to talk about what we call the long hot summer. That we are talking about the summer of '66 ends up being a very violent summer. Unfortunately, opinions and feelings are still clashing. A lot of frustration. People feel like still not seeing equality when it comes to income, when it comes to jobs and opportunities and education. So as these things continue to clash, there's more and more frustration that is coming about. Here's another group that is created in 1966, Black Panthers, out in Oakland, California. Bobby Seale and Huey Newton are going to be the creators and founders of the Black Panther movement. The biggest thing is that not only are they pushing and encouraging and accepting the idea of using violence and self-defense, but they are always pictured, heavily armed themselves, wearing the black beret, dressing in all black. Those are a couple of identifiers for that particular group. They call them a program for the people. Another thing that we'll get into next week is talking about Vietnam. Well, Vietnam starts in the 60s, and there's another frustration that why should African Americans and other minorities be drafted into a war to fight for a country that does not fight for their rights? So that's another frustration, is not being allowed to have military exemptions. The issue with unemployment, the issue with jobs, that minorities are being picked second and third in reference to whites and women. And then, of course, we get into more assassinations. 1966. 1966 is seen as the watershed year. We see more death happen, more violent outbreaks happen during that single year. Like the whole entire decade of the 60s is bad enough, but 1968 was a really, really horrible, awful year. 1968, Memphis, Tennessee, we see the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. James Earl Ray is on the roof of the building next door. He shoots and kills Martin Luther King Jr. on the balcony of his hotel. What is really interesting is that Dr. King had spoke at a church the night before and actually had said, and I quote, "I'm not afraid to die." And so, I think that he knew there were so many people out there. He, just like Abraham Lincoln and Jackie Robinson and so many others that are going against the norm, all were getting death threats. So he knew that there's hundreds of thousands of people out there that don't like him, don't agree with him, and that are out to get him. And I think that he really does believe that his numbered. I don't know that he necessarily had intuition to know that it was going to be the very next day, but he knew it, you know. James Earl Ray is charged with the murder. And here's another thing, and it really breaks my heart because you know that Dr. King had been pushing and advocating for nonviolent protest. Well, when it's announced that he has been assassinated, unfortunately, the reaction is riots that break out. Over 100 U.S. cities have riots that break out with people that are just brokenhearted that such a key leader in the civil rights movement has been killed. And for a lot of people, it's the last straw, you know, that they can't take much more. It's more bad news than good news. It's more heartache than anything. And so for a lot of people, that was it. You know, that was the last straw that broke the camel's back that has a lot of people changing their opinion on how this movement needs to go. So unfortunately, it's the opposite of what he was preaching. And I think he really would have been brokenhearted to know that that's how things were going to go. Again, another assassination. Robert Kennedy, the little brother of JFK, is assassinated. He was running for the Democratic candidacy for the 1968 election. He's going to be shot and killed in California while he's out campaigning by Sharon Sharon. All those assassinations are major blows to the civil rights movement, death of some of the best leaders and advocates. Nixon, we'll talk about him next week, but Nixon's going to win the 1968 election. Nixon is a Republican. This is his second time running for office. And we remember him during the Eisenhower years of the 1950s, and we really feel like we need somebody that's associated with good times and good news. And we associate the 1950s with a lot of good times, financially, etc. So the fight for civil rights is not over. It is still a long, hard fight. There's still a lot of problems that will arise. We do see a bigger trend, more racial pride in African American and other minority communities. We do have the Civil Rights Act of '68 that is passed that continues to outlaw discrimination. That one specifically is talking about housing or rentals and land property, that you can't deny the sale to someone because of race. We do know it is official that segregation is illegal. Now we just have to burn that into people's minds. We've got the Kerner Commission report that blames racism for a lot of the inner city problems, a lot of the violence and gangs that are popping up in inner cities. So it's not over. It's not said and done. We're still going to continue to talk about the fight for civil rights and issues that are there, but some of these things are going to be put on hold as we do not only get into Vietnam, but as Vietnam lasts a lot longer than people had imagined, and probably that it should have. But that's a discussion for next week, not today. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop there.